Alright, so in the last one we looked at just what the constructor does. Now we're going to make a method that's going to take whatever string input we put and align it to the center with borders the specific amount of characters in width printed on the sides. Right, so go back to here to all our constructors, and we get our methods. So the first one we created there was line. Now the next one I'm going to make a public void, and I'm going to call it mid, because the whole point is going to take a string input and turn it, or just basically use the length of this input, determine the amount of white space on either side, and then print it so that it's aligned it to the center. Right, so the first thing we're going to do is find out how long the string is. Because we've got the width of the actual console, using this input, we can then find out, okay, it's this long, therefore we need so many spaces on either side. So we're going to say int, I'm just going to call it length is equal to input.length, and that'll then tell us how long the string input is. Right, then we need to find out the total amount of white space. So I'm just going to call it ws. Firstly, we need to take our console width. So that's the total width of the console that we're allowed, minus 2. That 2 there is because we're going to have the symbols on either side, or the border. And then we need to say length, minus length. Right, so it's taking away the borders, how long the string is, and that means that's the total white space that is available to us. Right, then we now need to find out the amount of white space that goes on either side. One of the things we need to look out for though is if this input is not an even number. We haven't put any checks for that in, but this console width should always be even, just so we get a nice even split down either side. We could do something over here, say something like so if it's not equal to 0, in other words, it's not even, we can just add 1 to w. That'll then make sure that it's always, no matter what value we put in here, it'll always be an even number. Not that that's really necessary if we just make sure that we always put it in like that, but that at least makes sure that we don't make that mistake. Okay, so back to this. So we've got our total amount of white space. Now we need to find out the amount of white space on the left and on the right of either one. So we're going to call this int white space left, which is basically just going to be the amount of white space divided by 2. Then we also need right, which is just basically equal to the left side. The problem does come around though, that what if the length of this is not even? In that case, we can do this little check quickly. So if length mod 2 equals 0, so if that's even, then we'll get this to apply, because then either side will be the same. But if it's not even, we're then going to do, sorry, this is not going to be accessible outside of that, so let's just move this, just put those two and just get rid of dot types there. And so it'll set it inside that, and then we can do white space left is equal to white space divided by 2, and then for the right side, that means we're then going to get left but plus 1. Okay, so why are we doing this plus 1 there? So let's get some calculators out. May as well use our Casio. Right, so if we set it to 16, as it is set with the default here, have it set to 16 there. So we've got our console width is 16. We then take away 2 for the border, means that we're left with 14. Let's say we put a 5-letter word in. So we're going to then put a 5-letter word. That means we have 9 spaces left over. With 9 spaces left over, if we divide that by 2, it's going to give us 4.5. But because we're using integers, we can't use 4.5. So basically, we need to take both halves, add 1 to the one side, and then just use the 4 from the other end. In other words, to get to the 9, we're going to have 5 and 4 instead of 4.5 and 4.5. Okay, so that's what that little thing does. Then we are going to I'm going to use a string builder, and I like to call him Bob, because what we're going to do now is, as we go across, we're going to just be adding to this string and then print it out at the end. So the first thing we need to put onto it, so onto Bob, we're going to append the border. In this case, that is console symbol. So that puts our first part of the border. Then we need to find out the amount of white space to the left or the amount of white space to the right. Now I'm going to make a little method to do this particular thing, just because it's going to be a lot easier, because we're going to use it a few times. So basically this thing is just going to be a private string. So it can only be accessed by things in here. In other words, we can't use it in other classes. And this is going to be called, I'm just going to call it white space. We're going to put in an input. That input is going to be the amount of white space that we want it to print. I'm then going to use a for loop and basically just loop it for the amount of times of the white space we want. Set a string up here. And call it total white space, doesn't really matter. I guess we don't even have to actually put anything there. Or let's start it off with a just blank. Alright, so total white space, because we need to now put the amount of white space on either side of the word, we're going to say then total white space plus the space. Okay, and then at the end of that we will return the total white space. In other words, all that this thing is doing is saying, okay, on the one side of the word we need 4 white spaces, on the other side we need 5, and so this will just loop the amount of times that we need it to do that. Right, so then we can just append, and so we're going to use our white space method, and the length is going to be firstly on the left, then we append the actual input value, and then we're going to append white space on the right. Oh, sorry, we must actually create the white space, so that's going to be and finally append the console character, or the border character. Okay, so that is then our string that is created. We're going to have the border on either side, white space on the left, white space on the right, with the actual word in the middle. Then right at the end, I've set this as a void, so all it's going to do is print these values, and so we can call this then, let's put a system.out.print, and we're going to print Bob to string. Okay, it would probably actually be better if we set this to a string, return the string and then printed it, but just for now let's use this. Okay, so we go back to second lesson, we've got our first line. I'm going to use this 12 spots and we're going to say console a dot mid, and we're going to just print hi. Okay, and we can see then our hi is now positioned nicely in the center. On this side we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so it's evenly spread on either side. If we used an odd number or odd numbered letter, odd numbered word, so how, see here now, because we added that extra space to the right, it now means we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over there. If we had to go back and just change that, so instead of putting it on this side, we put it over there. See now, it moves over slightly on that side. Right, so it just depends on how you want to deal with that issue. Right, so that's just the method that allows us to do that. So now we can make this, instead of putting hi and how, we can just put header and something like info, and then put right, so we get our nice little header with info over there. Because both of them are even, it looks nice, everything's centered perfectly well. Alright, so that's then how we would create a method inside an object.